Um, so thank you again, everybody, for joining us for another edition of our virtual seminars. We have the pleasure of having Antonio Zaccheo for the second time now. Last time, you may remember, if you were on the call, he kind of did an overview of the entire winery and all the estates. This will be a little bit more of an in-depth look into some of his SKUs, most notably ones that are 100% varietals from his various estates. So with that, Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to Tuscany. The title of today's presentation is 100% Tuscany. So we're only limiting ourselves to 100% because we usually go 110. But nevertheless, it's a tasting tour of Tuscany through 100% varietal wines. And it is 100% varietal wines except for Brunello. Well, those are essentially a novelty, something that has only started, a few decades ago. Because up to then, our tradition in Tuscany has always been about blending. And in fact, we make 30 different wines. The majority, I would say 80% of them are all blended wines. Sangiovese with all the indigenous grape varieties, or super Tuscans that are blends of Sangiovese, Cabernet, Merlot, etc., etc. That is typically what has happened in the Tuscan landscape for centuries. In fact, many wines were also blends of multi-vintages to maintain consistency and drinkability. But anyway, aside from that, today we'll talk about the clones of Sangiovese. We'll talk about the geology of Tuscany. We'll talk about the climate, and then we'll dive into some of these wines and see what those are all about. So Sangiovese actually is something that we didn't know, obviously. Is a cross between two varieties. Ciliegiolo is a typical and indigenous grape variety from Tuscany, and Calabrese is a southern Italian grape. Where it happened, we don't know. But ever since we have now DNA analysis, and it's only been in the last 20 years, in 2007, Attilio Scienza, who is actually a luminary in Italian research on grapes, has come up with this news. And the Sangiovese is a big family, like all Italian families. The clones are essentially identical cells that share a common ancestry, and so the common ancestry is the fact that they come from Ciliegiolo and Calabrese. But then the clones have been developed by man in the vineyards. And so we have two different biotypes, which meaning that they share the same DNA. Of course, the most, where we have most clones is the Tuscan biotype, where the Chianti and Montalcino are more than half of that, and then Montepulciano and Morellino. And then it's the Romagna biotype, where there are 13 clones, and those would be the ones that Umberto Cesari in Emilia-Romagna would be using. So they are related, but they are slightly different. Already in 1876, the University of Siena, studying Sangiovese, understood that there are two families of Sangiovese. One is Sangiovese Grosso, and this one here is, it has Brunello and Prunello Gentile from Montepulciano. And then there is Sangiovese, which essentially is the families of Chianti Classico and Morellino. So that was an information that we already knew about 150 years ago. And but the interesting part with all these clones is that if you were to take an average of the flavor profile of all these clones, well, then you get here the red line. The red line is the average. But then individual clones, of course, deviate from the average. And then with, you know, there are various nurseries now that are developing their own clones. And so, for example, VCR is Vivae Cooperativi Rauscedo from northern Italy, is the biggest, how do you call it, nursery in Europe, probably in the world, I would imagine. Well, they just look at the diversity here of these clones. For example, if you're looking at spiciness, you know, Sangiovese is not a very spicy grape. It's not Syrah, for example. It's not Cabernet, and so it's somewhere in the middle of the scale. While this blue one, VCR 235, is very spicy. So what is interesting for us as winemakers is, you know, in order to get complexity in a wine, it's interesting to blend different clones. And that is typically what has been happening traditionally in Tuscany. So now we're going to talk a little bit about geology. And Mike, in case there are some questions, just have them, you know, just throw them in. I just want to, if you want, I just want to remind everyone that if they want good answers, they need to have, you know, they need to give me easy questions. Okay. So the geology here, this is central Tuscany. And so this is, you know what happens when you take a blanket and you push the two edges together? Well, then you create mountains, right? You create ups and downs. And that is what happens with the volcanic activity in Italy. And that is what happens when the North African plate pushes under the European plate. It creates mountains and it creates volcanic activity and earthquakes. Now, here in this case, we are having the opposite. So instead of the blanket being pulled together, it's being pulled apart. So when you pull it apart, you get a basin and range formation, much like you have in Nevada, for example, where it's valleys and mountains for hundreds of miles. And this is exactly what happened here. So if you were to take a line that goes from the seacoast of Tuscany all the way to the seacoast of Marche, then you have these fractures that show you the differences between the soil types. And also you have the situation, we have valleys, like for example, Val di Chiana, and then you have mountains. And this mountain here is going to be related to that mountain there and to that mountain here. But the sedimentary, of course, that depends upon the various layers of seas that have come in and out several times. So that's the geology of central Tuscany. And that's where Vino Nobile is right in between the Siena Basin, which is the Val d'Orcia, which is the UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the Val di Chiana Basin. That's where Brunello is. Montalcino sits right in between the seacoast, because then it slopes down to Maremma here, and the Val d'Orcia. It sits right on top of that square ridge there. It's called the Massiccio del Chianti. So what is interesting is that these three elevations here all share a common origin from a geology standpoint, or very similar. Here is a little information just to show you the size of these appellations. So hectares of vines, for example, Vino Nobile is only 3,000 acres. So it's a small appellation, as you can see. And out of the potential 40,000, we only cultivating 7% of the potential of the appellation, because we're growing above 1,000 feet. We're only picking the best sides of the hillsides. And so that's the reason why we're only growing a small piece of the potential. Brunello is less than 5,000 acres out of almost 60,000. Chianti Classico, which is the biggest of the Tuscan appellations, is almost 17,000 acres out of, so we're growing 10% of the appellation. Napa, which is considered to be a boutique appellation in America, well, look, it's 3 times the size of Chianti Classico. So it's quite a big appellation. And also Barossa, for example, is twice the size of Chianti Classico. So these little appellations that we're talking about today are special little places that are actually quite small. And this is an interesting part. Well, in Barossa, they only get 20 inches a year of rain, and they don't have any water there, so they don't irrigate. In Santa Elena, in the Napa, you get, you know, well, there's been some variability as of late, but these are historic numbers. You're getting somewhere around 35 to 40 inches of rain. In Chianti Classico, Vino Nobile, Brunello, you are all hovering around 30 inches of rain, and we're all dry farm. So it's a different world, it's a different environment completely. So this is a little picture. During the lockdown, we've had the chance to do a lot of things that we've never had time to do before. And one is to dig holes in the ground and pick soil samples for this kind of stuff, for pictures. And so, as I said, these soils here, from Dudda, Montalcino, Dudda is a Greve in Chianti, a Chianti Classico estate, our Brunello estate, and this is another right on the edge of Chianti Classico estate. These are all Galestro, basically. So they have a very similar profile, mineral chemical profile. While the Montepulciano and the Maremma estates are sedimentary of marine influence. And here, look at the Montepulciano down at the bottom here. Look at the blue hues in that clay. And that is cool because that is what gives the power to our Vino Nobile, is the blueness. So of the clay, because it's almost basically pure clay, but we'll get to that. So it's the climate that is different between our appellations. So for example, here, when you look at yearly rain, we looked at it earlier. Well, in 2010, we had a lot of rain, but it was all mostly winter rain. But what is interesting to note is that on average, Montalcino, which is the middle line, gets a little bit less rain than the rest. And at the end of the day, Montepulciano is probably the one that gets the most. Rain during the growing season, that's where the fun part begins, because this is in inches. We're getting 12 inches here. No, that's 15 inches here in 2010. That's 14 on average, and this is down to about a dozen inches, which, depending on the soil, you're going to stress the vines certainly more in certain areas and less in others. But on average, Chianti Classico, the red line, and Montepulciano get about the same rain. Again, Montalcino is drier, and that the reason is because there is the Monte Amiata, is a volcano that is nearby, that is 6,000 feet, and it deviates the wind flow at high altitude, therefore moving the clouds away from town. Winkler index is something that you look at that is very interesting. It's basically a sum of the median temps during the growing season. And so basically, it shows you which is the warmer of the appellations during the growing season. Montalcino, which is closer to the ocean on the map, well, it makes sense that it's warm. Chianti Classico is the second warmest, and Montepulciano is the furthest from the ocean. And also Montepulciano happens to be a continental climate, because as you've seen, we are several peaks and valleys inland. And so there we tend to have warm days, but we also tend to have very cool nights. So, for example, I live in a house that is from the 1700s. It's got thick walls. And of course, these thick walls have the ability to isolate you from the heat, but we don't have air conditioning in the house. it is necessary that you open the windows at night when you go to bed, and on the farm we get up early, 6 a.m. You close everything, and you maintain the coolness of the night in your house. So that is why the wines are good, because we have these temperature excursions there in Montepulciano, but we have them in Montalcino and Chianti Classico too, but not as much. Then, of course, if you look at, this is another index of looking at climate and comparing the various appellations. This one is a sum of the temps corrected for latitude. You have to keep in mind that, it's interesting to note that, for example, here, let me quickly look at my notes here. The Napa Valley is at the same latitude as Palermo in Sicily. So, and Florence is at the same latitude as Eugene, Oregon. So we are making wines more or less at the same band, but California is on average growing at a much lower latitude. Therefore, the brightness of the sun is quite much more intense. And that is what the Hagelin index does. It corrects for latitude, trying to understand what the degree days are. And regardless, Montalcino is still the warmer of the appellations, again, with Montepulciano being cooler and Chianti Classico being right in the middle. Climate dryness, this is another index that we look at, and here the lower the bar, the drier the climate. So on average, again, Montalcino is drier, well, as we've seen, because it doesn't rain as much. Montepulciano, because of the cool nights, you know, it's probably the coolest of, at the end of the day, of the appellations. So that basically gives you an idea of the geology of Tuscany. And again, here it's a little bit of an overview of the vintages that we have here in the last couple of decades. A lot of 3 and 4 and 5 star vintages. And then I also have all the best vintages from the past, 90, 88, 85, 75, 70. So if you're born in those years, you are lucky people. And 2019 is a 5-star vintage, so we are very excited about that. And now we're digging into wine, and of course Sangiovese is our specialty, as you know, and we're going to talk about Sangiovese, but we're going to also talk about a couple of other things. So our wines are made in our estates, which are all carbon neutral, meaning that our vineyards, woods, and olive groves absorb more. And we're working hard on the emissions. I don't know if you've noticed, for example, the bottle of Dogaiolo has gotten lighter over the last 3 years. We've gone from 420 grams to 360. And you know, that of course helps the carbon footprint. And then we're doing a bunch of other things like more fuel efficient tractors, and I mean, really many improvements to get to that neutrality, you know, to improve on our positiveness. So the first estate we're gonna visit is the first estate that was purchased back in 1967 by Giancarlo Sacchetta, our chief winemaker, and my father. It is right here is in Tudda, Greve in Chianti, and we are at about 1,000 feet in elevation. So we're not as high as many of the estates surrounding us, but we are towards the bottom of the valley, surrounded by these mountains, which create these wonderful cool airflows during the night. So here again, even though Chianti Classico is somewhere in the middle, you know, between Brunello, which is warmer, and Vino Nobile, which is cooler. Well, here we are probably even cooler than Vino Nobile because of this particular microclimate that we're in. This is just a picture of the vineyards here. and more pictures of the vineyards, and the winery is down there in this area. But we're talking about this wine today, which is the Gran Selezione. So the Gran Selezione is, I mean, the Chianti Classico Riserva is pretty close to 100% Sangiovese, but in the old vineyards, as we said earlier, tradition is about blending. Well, we have still some whites, some Trebbiano, some Malvasia, Canaiolo, Moraiolo, Canaiolo, Colorino, etc., planted in there. But this one here, since we had such a special piece of dirt, we said, hey, let's make this 100% Sangiovese, and Caterina has done a heck of a job. It's a vineyard that we replanted in 2002 because the original vineyard, of course, was from '67. After almost 40 years, it had run its course, and we planted it to several clones of Sangiovese. It is Galestro soil. I've showed you what Galestro is. Galestro is a recurring theme that we'll have today because it is on all the hilltop towns, is this clay schist, which is essentially marine clay that has been over the millions of years, from about 15 million years, it was buried under massive amounts of other material, mountains and stuff. And so it is metamorphized into this very fine dirt, stone that actually breaks like shale does. So you can actually use these stones for skipping on the lake. They are perfect. They are the right size, and they are thin and actually quite frail. This wine spends about 1.5 years in barriques, and then it gets, well, here we say 1 year of bottle age, but the reality is that all of our wines get well over 1 year, close to a couple, because we are still in 15 and we're going to be releasing 16 soon. So, that's a 4-year-old wine. And in the Carpineto tradition of top wines, these are all unfiltered, unfined, and vegan friendly. I always tell people that our wines are vegan friendly. We are not so friendly because we do eat the vegans, the sheep and the cows, and etc., etc. So, I mean, they go so well, with the wine, so we can't help ourselves. So, of course, this wine, the Gran Selezione, is gotten a really nice score in the Spectator, which is the world's premier wine magazine. It is a perfect expression of what Chianti Classico, Northern Chianti Classico is, because you see, Sangiovese grown up there in the cool climate on Galestro, this clay schist. Well, it has a lot of black cherry, red cherries, violets. It's very floral, and then it also has sort of an iron and leather on the finish. It's just a very special perfumey wine. It is not a very big, powerful wine, although for Sangiovese it is, in the sense that it combines power with elegance and great balance. Anyways, 15 is the current vintage and is the crown jewel of our Chianti Classico estate. Now we go to Brunello, and here again, now remember, the hilltops that I showed you, they go throughout the Chianti Classico, especially the northern Chianti Classico where we are, and then Montalcino. So the further up you go, the more you are bound to be growing grapes on rocks. So essentially what we have here is the Brunello sits on this ridge, and it's a northern exposure, and it's on a Galestro outcropping. So here essentially we are above the clouds, we're above the humidity. Maremma is down there on that side of the hill. And so the airflow comes this way, but basically it doesn't bring the humidity that you would have on the other side of the ridge. And so it's only 25 acres of vineyards surrounded by these big woods, which incidentally are full of porcini mushrooms. And since we had some rain, and you know, and then some heat has come, and so therefore the conditions are perfect for porcini mushrooms to be found around here. The cellars are below this this building, and the current vintage is 15. Of course, we talked about 2015 being an awesome vintage, and we're very proud of this wine. So it's replanted mostly in the 2003 to 2005. So it's actually a 15 to 20-year-old vineyard at this point. It's right in the peak of its maturity. The spacing is somewhere around 2,000 vines per acre, which is great for Sangiovese Grosso. It's the clone of Sangiovese up here. But it's great density for this kind of soil that we have. It spends 3 years in the large oak casks and then 1 year of bottle age. And that's a wine that has gotten some very great reviews in American magazines, but also, of course, in here in Europe. I mean, 2015 is one of those vintages that it was just so easy to make good wine. It was just spectacular. We wish to have more 15s. So anyways, and as of next year, January 2021, there will be a Riserva from 2015. Now we go to Montepulciano, which of all our land holdings is our largest estate. It is 450 acres, mostly planted now. And it is an area that 5 million years ago was under the sea during the Pliocene era. So you are bound to find and see all kinds of fossil life as you walk in the vineyards. So this is a huge oyster. It's the diameter is like a small pizza, but we have them of all sizes. But of course, we take the picture of the biggest ones, right? And then this is a scallop. But then we have a whole variety of sea life you can find in the vineyards. This is on this estate we have 250 acres, all planted to high density, which makes it probably the biggest contiguous high density vineyard in Italy. We're very proud of this achievement here. On the lower part, we have a natural reserve that migratory birds use as they move north to south, and it is just a beautiful place. This is the Cetona Mountain, which is also an extinguished volcano, about 1,500 feet in elevation. And these are the Vino Nobile vineyards here on the forward part. Pieces, productions of Dogaiolo come from here, but we're not talking about that today because those are all blended wines. And Vino Nobile Riserva, we're not talking about that either. These are many of the single vineyard wines that we make here, of which we're going to talk about two. The first one is this one, Vigneto. It's again a small vineyard, 12 acres. About a third was planted in '78 to a multitude of clones, like we used to do back then. Also, it has some white grapes in there. It has also Canaiolo, Colorino, Mammolo. It is a whole traditional Tuscan melting pot. But in '95, we planted 2/3 of this vineyard to a particular clone of Sangiovese called F9 on a rootstock 420A that is very good at growing on clay, because growing on clay is quite complicated because it has there's always good and bad news with anything, as you know. So clay has this good news. As you've seen, we don't have much rain during the growing season. So clay essentially has this ability to hold water. But in rainy years, it is a disaster because the water doesn't go away. And so the rootstocks can actually drown. I mean, you get a lot of problems. You get potassium problems that come from vines staying in a swampy environment because clay doesn't drain very well. But for the most part, since we are in the Mediterranean climate and the rain is not so much during the growing season, clay is mostly good news. And as we said, we are on this particular kind of clay called the blue clay, which has a very special mineral profile. So it's sedimentary and limestone, the soil. And this is a special wine because we take the wine, we give it 1 year in brand new barrels, and then unfiltered, unfined, it goes straight into the bottle. And it stays there 5-6 years before release. We are just now coming out with the 2012 vintage. So obviously it's something that we're taking our time releasing. So, and this is also a wine that's gotten a lot of great scores in America. Vinum is German, Dr. Wine is Italian, even though he has an English name, but he is an Italian guy, very smart guy, Cernilli. This is the winery where it is made, and I will go quickly here since we are running a little. Are we running a little late, Mike? No, we're good. Okay. This is the barrels where the Sant'Enrico, of course, is aged, and the Farnito Cab, and of course on the sides is where the Vino Nobile hangs out for 2 to 3 years. More images of the aging here. This is an old aging cellar that's right below my office. And so, you know, this is, these oak casks are, you know, 30, 40 years old, but this whole building here, as you can see, is, so if it ain't broke, we don't fix it, as we love saying on the farm. Now we're talking about something special. Now we're talking about Farnito Cabernet Sauvignon. So this is a wine that we started experimenting with in Gaville, near our headquarters in Greve in Chianti, already in the 70s. We planted Sauvignon Blanc, which was a failure up there, Chardonnay, which we slowly got in line, and then we planted Cabernet. We were lucky to plant Cabernet in the right spot right from the beginning. And but you know, that vineyard was a small, you know, it was a couple of acres, so it wasn't nearly enough to cover the needs for this wine. So we came down here in Vino Nobile and we planted this very high density vineyard, about 80, that's about 3,500 plants per acre. But when you plant a vineyard of this size, now can you see my cursor here that goes up and down? You can see it. Okay, so the vineyard rows here are 400 yards. And look at the soil differences that there are, because it's sedimentary. And so, of course, the soil changes every 3 meters. You know, the soil changes. What you see here, the dark spots, of course, is where there's more vigor in the vineyards because it's a satellite picture. So this is heavier on clay, and this is heavier in sand. These white spots where there is less vigor. And so, how do you take 400 yards with all this soil variation and make the vineyards look all uniform? That is the million-dollar question. Well, you do a lot of digging of the soil and you understand what's below you, because what you see here, this consistency, is something that doesn't come just because you wish it. It comes because you, by design, you get to it eventually. And so in these 400 yards here, and look at the beautiful consistency of this vineyard, we have 4 different clones of Cabernets although the mostly planted is CL191. And then we have several different rootstocks, because they all have to balance the soil. It's like if you're racing cars, you know, if you're racing on a race on a car on a track, then you're going to have a certain suspension setting. If you're doing off-road racing, then you're going to have a different suspension setting, and that is the same concept for us managing the soil and balancing it to the vine. So here is just an example of what we're doing on the Cabernet clone called CL191. So basically, the bunch weight, as you can see, is this is an average, cultivar average. So as you can see, the 191 is much lighter. The yield per vine is much lower. The pruning weights are good and are an average, but the Ravatz index is basically, when you take a yield from a current harvest. So you identify in the vineyards certain vines that you follow over the life of that vineyard. And so you go and you pick those grapes and you weigh them and you keep a note. Vine number 7 had 2 pounds of grapes. And then in the fall, in the winter, when you prune, you go and prune that vineyard and you go with a scale in the middle of the vineyard. It sounds kind of nuts, but that's what you do. And then you write down, you know, how much wood you actually pruned off of that vine. And then you do this ratio where you look at the yield versus the pruning weights, and that gives you an index. And of course, the lower the index means that well, it's a little complicated, but basically it means that the wood per cluster is higher, meaning that you got more power. It's kind of like in a small car, you put a V8. Well, that car is going to run faster than if you put a V8 in a bus. Okay, so that's basically the overall concept of why we look at this index. And so we use a lot of 428 rootstocks, which you know, again, we are looking for modest vigor, and then we're pairing it with these various soil types, and that is of course the challenge. But you know, this is the soil, and then of course again, it's mostly clay, so you got to work it, tilling it quite often, because it tends to crack, and evaporation is quite strong. And then you have to tame it, you know, even though we're using the vigorating rootstocks in certain years, there still is a lot of crop out there, and then we got to balance it, leaving only one cluster per shoot. Because you know, in order to make good vintages, yes, we need certainly good luck, but God helps those who help themselves. And I think any religion will tell you much the same. So that's Cabernet. So it's a big wine. It's 100% Cab. It spends 1 year in barrels and then a lot of bottle age. It's just a beautiful, elegant, minerally, balsamic, beautiful core of red and dark fruits. It's quite a special bottle. And obviously we were very honored and proud to get a nice score on this wine, which it only retails for, you know, $35 on the shelf. So it's a heck of a deal, actually, if I can say so. Now, out of that vineyard, we don't always make this wine, and we don't always make this wine out of the same spot. But we will walk the vineyards, and we will say, hey, so we're going to pick these rows, or we're going to pick this part of these rows, because we're going to only make 3,000–4,000 bottles. And this is a single vineyard, the filet mignon of a single vineyard. So it's really a special bottle. Again, it goes into a year in brand new barrels, and then it gets 5 years of bottle age. So it's a wine. While the Farnito Cabernet is very elegant, this one is just a brute, and that's why we're releasing now the 2012 vintage. And there you need to organize yourselves with something with a lot of marbling and nice T-bone with a lot of marbling and cook it rare. So, so now during lockdown, as you know, well, you may not have paid attention, but there has been a new amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And, you know, there's always a preamble at any amendment. And it goes like this. In the land of the free, with the finest prime beef, don't give Americans grief. Give Napa cabs some relief. In the home of the brave, help Americans save. Tuscan cabs are the rave. And so essentially it says, the 34th Amendment is that thou shalt no longer serve only Napa Cabernet in American steakhouses. As delicious as it is, because I love Napa Cabernet. I have several in my collection. Well, I used to have several, but during lockdown I've drank a lot of them. But nevertheless, the concept is that obviously if you can have your customers drink a $35 bottle of award-winning wine and save money, why wouldn't you do that? So anyways, another wine, this is the last wine I'll talk about, and we're doing on time with, whoops, that went on its own. Anyways, it's a sparkling wine, because, so Giancarlo Sacchetti, he passed away a couple of years ago, unfortunately, but Caterina has done a heck of a job with the winemaking. And this is a wine that has been producing since the early 80s, because he went to school to Conegliano Veneto, famous enology school, which is right in the middle of Prosecco country. And so he learned how to make red wine, white wine, all of that. But there, they specialized in also making Prosecco. So when he moved down to Tuscany after the few years, he understood Sangiovese well, had that under his belt, and he says, hey, but I still love sparkling wine. And so he started messing around with sparkling wines, and he's been doing that, ever since. And so that's the reason why we have 4 different sparkling wines in our portfolio. This one is the crown jewel. It is a Tuscan Blanc de Blanc. So it is not a classical method. It is a Charmat bulk process, but it spends 6 months on the lees, which are agitated at various intervals, to get that creaminess, that interest in this wine. So it is 100% Chardonnay, and it is a beauty. In fact, I have a glass right here. On the Vino Nobile estate, so the grapes for that actually comes from the Vino Nobile estate, but here we also make Vinsanto, and so I think we're basically done. I'll show you a couple of the accolades. We've had some great scores from England. This is from Germany. That's from America. This is Italian. We're a little stingier with Italian wines, typically. Of course, Wine Spectator has been generous to us lately, and that's a pretty impressive lineup. Caterina we're very proud of her. But the one I'm mostly proud of is this. When you get a Best Buy on Dogaiolo from England, decanter, Spectator, and the enthusiast, well then, we know we're doing something right, because of course getting a big score on a big wine, yes, that's expected and it's necessary. But getting a Best Buy on Dogaiolo, it's something that makes our chest swell quite a bit. So, anyways, that's it. How am I doing on time? Did I do okay? Well, I talked a little longer than normal.
We cut you off a little early last time, so I was going to give you a few more minutes this time. So not a problem at all. It was perfect.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, cheers.
Salute. From Tuscany.
Yeah.
With the heart.
Yeah, exactly. So Yeah, thank you again, Antonio. We'll open it up to some questions now. Feel free to type them in as you need. There's a few here already that I'll ask you, Antonio. If you want to ask a question, you actually want to talk to Antonio, raise your hand and I can unmute you. But the first question here was, if the areas are so similar, why would the Grosso clones be planted in the southern areas while the Sangiovese is grown in Chianti?
Well, that's just, it's a very complex place. It has a very long history. And the feudal families, the noble families that owned the land, didn't really communicate much with one another. Siena and Florence have been at war for centuries. And so so they all developed their own clones, they developed their own things. For example, in Siena, we have developed the white rooster, while in Chianti Classico is the black rooster, which is also the symbol of Chianti Classico that comes from a long legend. And the same can be said about the clones of Sangiovese. So, of course, in Morellino, however, the clone is similar to Chianti Classico, and that is because it was brought by the Florentine down there. While in the Siena province, we are growing mostly the Sangiovese Grosso clone because that's what was developed here.
Excuse me, Antonio, have you done any experimentation with the Grosso clone in the Chianti Classico appellation?
We have some Sangiovese Grosso planted there. In fact, in the Gran Selezione vineyard is various clones because we're aiming for complexity of flavors. And yes, we have taken Sangiovese Grosso up there, and it does great. But just like we've taken Sangiovese and brought it down to Montepulciano, for example, and growing it there. So yeah, we're doing a bunch of that because. Because we're looking at that flavor profile that I showed you earlier. Let's see if I can run up and get it. Right there. You know, when you plant a vineyard, you're looking at all the soil types and you're looking at all the rootstocks and all the exposures of the vineyards, and we're planting a lot of individual vineyards. And so, of course, we're looking for complexity of flavor as well. And so adding these various clones, having various vineyards with different clones adds to that. And so, yes, we're doing that. And the universities have been great already with the Chianti Classico 2000 project that was started 30 years ago in identifying these clones and mapping them out and helping us farmers choose the right clones for our soil and for our climate. But yeah, we're doing our own as well, of course.
Okay, man, very good. There's a question here from Michael Potter. Is the increase in the median temperature in those three regions, those charts you were showing earlier, from 2010 to 2015, indicative of climate change? And if so, how are you combating the warmer temperatures?
Let me see. Well, so that's rain, that's yearly rain. Hang on. I mean, this is the degree days. Okay, now, of course, you can see the trend 10 to 15 is going up the degree days. But that is, I don't think we can see a trend in only 5 years. Climate trends are decades long, many decades long averages that you got to look at. But certainly, yes, I mean, it's gotten warmer and it's gotten on average drier. And so we are adopting now in Tuscany many of the things I learned in California, where, for example, we're shading the fruit, which we didn't do back then, back when I was a kid, because back then, you know, we had bigger yields and therefore longer hang times. Now we're using one cluster per shoot, and of course, that cluster gets phenologically perfectly ripe and gets picked at the right time. And other things we're doing, well, in Chianti Classico, we were just lucky to essentially find right away a very cool climate place to grow grapes. In Montalcino, we're growing on a northern slope. So we're very high. We're one of the highest vineyards in the estate with a northern slope. So our vineyard is one of the last to be picked in the entire appellation. And so that's what we're doing. We're looking for things like that, northern slopes covering the fruit. And then doing soil management where you're trying to, in Montepulciano, for example, you're tilling a lot to avoid the cracking of the soil, because some of these cracks, they can go down 2-3 feet and they create evaporation that you don't want in a place where you don't irrigate. By law, we don't irrigate, and you've seen it doesn't rain very much in the summer. So yeah, we're doing what we can, and then we're very religious. Every now and then we go to church.
Can't hurt, right?
No.
Another question from George. He wants to know production on the 2015 Brunello. How much did you make? And he also wishes he was there with you right now.
Well, I wish you were all here with me right now, and hopefully that can happen very soon. So the production of the 15 Brunello is somewhere around, I forget the exact number, but it's somewhere around 30,000 bottles. It's not a big production. And we also do somewhere around 20,000 of the Rosso di Montalcino. And the Riserva is just a few thousand bottles. It would be a very special wine. So it's only 25 acres and grown on Galestro, very high up in elevation mountain fruit. It is very low yielding. The whole estate, does 60,000 bottles, which is nothing compared to some parts of the world. If it was Prosecco, I'd be doing several truckloads.
Exactly.
But it's Sangiovese Grosso grown at altitude in a dry farm environment. So it's a different world.
Another question from George. What does more wood per cluster in this Ravazza index add to the flavor profile of the wine?
Well, it basically, it takes a magnifying lens onto the grape, and it just packs it densely with polyphenols, with all the good stuff that you want if you want to make a powerful wine. Of course, in the vineyards where we're making the Rosato for Dogaiolo, there you don't want a very high Ravazza index because you want something more delicate, more floral. But if you're making a Cabernet Sauvignon, then you want to focus the energy of that canopy on very few clusters and making sure that you get perfect phenolic ripeness and great intensity and density.
Okay. See what else we got here. A few high praises for the Sant'Enrico. I love that wine. I love that wine. So not a question, but a compliment that never hurts.
Well, that wine was, it's a special wine because it was the first, we think, we don't know for sure, but we think it was the first 100% Sangiovese wine made within the Vino Nobile appellation. So we had that intuition already in the 90s, which, back then it was all about blending. And our Riserva, of course, is all about blending of different clones and a little Canaiolo and indigenous grape varieties for interest. But that is a special bottle. It's certainly my desert island wine in case there is game on the island.
The origins of the Cabernet clones that you use, where were they from originally?
Yeah, those are Bordeaux clones originally that were brought in many years ago, and then of course the universities have done a lot of work on them, heat treatments and stuff like that, and then they've been propagated by Rauscedo, which is up in northern Italy, this nursery, and but they are the DNA is French.
Another question here. This one's from Craig. Is anyone making wine from the two parent grapes of Sangiovese that you mentioned in the beginning of the presentation for like regular commercial release, either as a single variety wine or a blend?
Yeah, so Calabrese is a southern Italian grape variety, and yeah, there are some small producers that do 100% of those, same with Chile and Jolo, but they're not really indicated for single varietal production. It's like Petit Verdot. It just comes to mind because everybody knows it. I mean, 100% Petit Verdot is not a pleasant wine on average because it's just too much. You know what I mean? So it's best just in a blend. Those are varieties that are a little bit like the cheese on the pasta, where a little bit, provides balance and perfume and all of that. But if you put too much or too much garlic in the sauce, it's overkill.
Understood. I think I don't see any hands raised. I don't have see any other questions. Steve Iacino said, Farnito Cab, my all-time favorite wine. Thank you for making it. So there's that.
Grazie, Steve.
Yeah, I think that's it. I will give it another minute, but see if anybody has any other questions. But I just wanted to, again, thank you, Antonio, for your time. It's always great to see you and always great to listen to your stories. And thank you for enlightening us on the 34th Amendment. I had no idea that happened, but it's good to know
Oh, yeah, pay attention to it.
You're following U.S. law in the news. That's great. So we appreciate that. And, again, thank you. Thank you all for attending as well. And have a good weekend. Antonio, enjoy your dinner. If there's anything you want to say in closing, please take it away. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Pichi, for this great opportunity. I, of course, look forward to seeing you soon in person because there's nothing better than cleaning a glass together over a nice meal. So I look forward to that happening very, very soon. Salute, guys.
Salute. Thank you, Antonio.
Ciao tutti. Thank you,
Ciao.
Antonio.
Ciao, Antonio. Thank you so much.
Grazie. Ciao.
Thanks again, Antonio. That was great.
Grazie.